Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Caruana, and on behalf of CIM, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. Before we start, I'd like to just respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all meeting today and recognise that these have always been lands where learning has taken place through storytelling and the sharing of experiences. And we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. In the spirit of that today, we will be sharing a whole bunch of stories with our industry experts around the evolving landscape of commercial property market, with a focus on office and retail today, and some of the trends that we're predicting to dominate the industry into the next financial year and beyond. I look forward to facilitating another lively and insightful discussion today, and it's really great to have such great speakers with us today. Just before I introduce them, please feel free to send your questions through to us. Part of the dialogue that we want to have today and that discussion and information sharing comes from the questions you ask. So please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists. And if your question is for a specific person, please make that clear when you use the Q&A function so that we know who to ask or who to grill at that particular moment. So today's panel has three amazing speakers on it, people you may have seen before on previous CIM webinars. To start off, we have Davina Rooney, the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia. Davina's got extensive experience in the sustainability area, from environmental projects to not-for-profit boards and overseas community work. And she's also an engineer with extensive experience in building consulting. Mark Steinert was recently the former CEO and managing director of Stockland, someone you probably all heard of and seen before around as well, and is the former global head of real estate research for UBS. He's now a non-executive director for the Western Parkland City Authority, overseeing the development of the first new city in Australia for 100 years. He's an advisory board member for Western Earth Moving, as well as numerous philanthropic roles. That's a big word to throw in there, isn't it? Philanthropic. And finally, we have Dave Walsh, the founder and CEO of CIM. CIM is a leading market-leading building analytics software company, helping most of the major building property owners in Australia to run their buildings more efficiently and sustainably. They're our hosts today, and we thank them for putting this together and bringing us all here for another discussion as part of this ongoing webinar series. So today, we're going to hit four major areas through the webinar. We're going to look at market dynamics, sustainability, tenant preferences, and technology and data. As I said before, if you've got questions for our panelists, please put them through using the Q&A function. And if we don't get to your specific question, we will try to respond after the webinar directly to you. So let's kick things off. We're going to start the discussion by looking at some market dynamics. Despite obvious challenges and complexities with current market conditions, many parts of the sector have shown strong performance, highlighting resilience in the face of adversity. So Mark, we're going to start with you. We've had this period of elevated inflation and interest rates, which has challenged the Australian commercial property sector. But some recent indicators offer cause to feel a bit more upbeat. Where do you see the market heading in terms of values over the coming year or two? And which commercial asset classes are likely to perform best in your view?
Sure, thanks, Anthony. It's great to be here. Obviously interest rates are the main game in my view, and they'll determine the next move in commercial values from here. Obviously market consensus has been shifting on that topic, with I think now higher for longer as it relates to inflation, becoming, I guess, the consensus with the persistence of services inflation and higher energy costs. That's delayed the upturn. However, we can see that inflation has trended materially lower all around the world, and interest rates should decline, if not late this year, then early in 2025, and that should see the commencement of positive values, in my view. Having said that, obviously not all sectors are created equal, and we'll see differentiated performance. I think residential are not the focus today, and logistics will perform the best, given chronic undersupply and double-digit rent reversions for industrial. Retail should do next, and I think retail is now consistently performing a lot better than people were predicting, with CPI increases in rents and a reasonable outlook for consumption reflecting both high employment levels and high levels of migration. But also, we've now had a number of years of below average new supply. Office, I think it's going to still lag, given the continuing oversupply and the uncertainty regarding work from home. Obviously, it's encouraging to see leasing levels picking up. It's good to see. Obviously, supplies really slowed down, and premium and prime is outperforming secondary, and that's where the tenant focus is. But obviously, incentives are still pretty high. I think the sleeper will be secondary stock. I think actually you're probably going to see quite a lot of redevelopment for residential. There's a lot of government motivation for that, and so you'll see, I think, some pretty strong bidding for secondary assets that will ultimately get redeveloped.
So, Davina, we're in the midst of this property down cycle. How can sustainability help commercial property owners stay resilient and weather this storm?
Well, I think it helps them to stay relevant. We're in a stage in commercial property where you've got to earn the commute. Whichever asset class you're in retail, it's clicks and bricks. You're competing with Amazon, so you need an experience that makes you come in. In office, you need your culture and your home and your office to actually be better than someone's bedroom. And so in each case, you're actually looking for what you as an asset owner can bring, and that's a wrap of community. Now, on the investor side, we've never seen more push for sustainability. This isn't like the GFC where it was just cut everything, do nothing, cut all that sustainability stuff unless it saves money. In this particular time, we are seeing not just green bonds, but the entire market. If you don't have a sustainability story, you cannot access finance in key markets. So, and I think the real opportunity here is we're going to see more and more reporting, which either means entire teams dedicating their time to write people down, or smarter systems and analytics, so that we can actually streamline that so people can spend more time making the magic and less time reporting on it. So I'm sure we can talk more about that later, but in this stage of the market, sustainability has to be your competitive advantage. Whenever there's a downturn, there's a flight to quality. In this market, sustainability outperformance is the flight to quality metric.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. Thanks, Davina. Dave, so CIM works with many different commercial property owners across Australia. So you've got this very broad view of what you see across the landscape. What are you hearing from senior property leaders in relation to their optimism about where the market's heading in the near term?
Look, it touches on two things that both Mark and Davina said in relation to the secondary stock and just that requirement for operational efficiency. So for us, like, operational efficiency is sustainability, right? And that, like, operational performance means that people are looking to see how they can use the data that they're generating to tap into things like green bonds, sustainability linked loans. And we see clients accessing cheaper interest rates by providing the lender with better data sets. I also see that people are looking to get more around the business problems that they have within their building. So if something like lifts are a problem, people want to get the data from that to try and ensure that the complaints or the feedback from the tenants, like if it's negative around the lifts, well then how do they get data to get that operational performance out of those assets performing better? Indoor air and thermal comfort, which is obviously neighbours, i.e. is very important. So people are the owners that we're talking to. We have a broad view, Anthony, but the stuff we tend to be back of house and into the plant room, and every single hot and cold complaint or every single thermal comfort issue is because the systems aren't performing correctly, and they're just things that the owners are now saying no more. It's totally unnecessary, and we need to ensure that, back to what Davina said, that you earn the commute, and that the basic requirement that no matter what time of the day or night that someone's working and the temperature externally, that they're able to work and be productive in the office environment. We're now dealing with the likes of JP Morgan Chase, and they told me earlier this week that they have 325,000 employees globally, and one of their smart building initiatives is just to ensure that as many of those employees are productive and they're not being affected by the office space being too hot or too cold. And it's a huge number if you think 10 or 15 or 20% of those people might be complaining about conditions, and it's just not good enough. So it's a move to quality. It's also moving to leverage the data and to ensure that you can drill into areas that previously were kind of hidden.
Thanks for that, Dave. Obviously, we're talking a lot about, we've talked a bit about resilience and the impact of sustainability into that. We're going to talk a little bit more about sustainability now, and it's obviously a really, really major topic. Davina's touched on it, David's touched on it, Mark's already touched on it. So there's a lot of things going on at the moment. Davina, what are some of the emerging trends that you predict are going to dominate the year ahead when it comes to, dare we use the word greening, commercial property portfolios?
Great. So I'm going to talk about a few of the market trends and then a little bit of a what does it mean to the players. So we're seeing a huge move on globalization. Investors are saying, I'm sick of hearing about all your country related schemes. Tell me what you're doing globally. Finance is global. I want global solutions. So in the middle of this year, ourselves, the Green Building Council of the US and the BRE are launching a global finance guide of how it relates to properties. Why? Investors are sick of working out who we all are and why it's different in every damn jurisdiction. We need clarity, we need fast movement, and if you're going to need that, we need a more frictionless system. Huge investor trends at the moment are to talk the same journey that climate's been on in the last decade. Nature's on that journey. So there's a thing called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which follows the climate pathway. If you'd like to learn more about it, the Green Building Council has a consultation out at the moment for how does big picture nature affect property today and tomorrow. We're seeing a lot of discussion on embodied carbon. Now, those of you running existing office portfolios might say, what's that got to do with me? We throw out more stuff in fit outs than we spend building the building. Fit outs are the only time that someone moves house, throws out everything they own and buys it all new again. I mean, there's a global circularity index and each year it gets worse. So something's got to change. And we've got to be really engaged as owners on what we put into the buildings, not just at the start, but each of the stages. So I'll give you a stat. A new building built in Australia now will have more emissions in its materials than its operational energy through its whole life. That's changed in the last 5 years. That's why you're hearing so much about materials, because with the greening of the grid, that's changed a lot. We're going to hear a lot about grid interruptive buildings. How do buildings work together with the grid so that when there's heaps of renewables in the grid and things change a little bit over time, how do buildings change a little bit with them? So I think we should unpack that more in the webinar later on. But what does this all mean to property owners? Fundamentals are still important. Get your fundamentals right. Unless you're doing the basics well, you actually don't have permission to go out and talk about these cool new trends. An investor doesn't want to hear about your global approaches if you haven't worked out your data, haven't optimized it, haven't started in this space. The other things I think is it's a global game. Get ready to talk about a global game, because even if you're operating in one jurisdiction, your investors aren't, your customers aren't. And they want to hear from you how you make it easy for them to do the thing that head office, which could be in New York, could be in London, could be in Sydney, how you can help them work with property, which usually isn't their core business, to make their dreams happen.
And just to duck in there, I think, sustainability's become, an absolute ticket to the ball, if you like, or the baseline. The next baseline, I think, is, as Davina said, circular economy. That's going to be all the focus, because, the tolerance for waste and even the capacity to fund the waste, has diminished dramatically. So I think you'll see a massive focus on this. And there is actually quite tremendous, upside, both in terms of dollars and also in terms of, how humans experience their living environment.
And so I was at the World Circular Economic Forum in Brussels a fortnight ago. Norwegian ministers were announcing that they were mandating manufacturers to be accountable for their own waste. A tyre manufacturer, it was their job to get the tyres back at the end of it. we're seeing game changers where what we've said are the split incentives that have made this hard. Regulators are getting ready to reallocate those split incentives back where they belong. I spoke to Minister Plibersek last week when the federal government put out their first circularity announcement with us. Procurement announcement. How fast is this space moving? Minister Plibersek announced new circularity requirements from 1 July, announced last week. Federal government procurement over $7.5 million. That's how fast this space is moving. As Mark says, ticket to the game, ticket to the ball.
Can I chime in and just give a very kind of nuts and bolts example as well from clients that we're dealing with? Extending the life cycle of expensive equipment, or even getting an understanding, like if you look at a building, we'll have in many cases thousands of pieces of equipment, and a life cycle assessment is what you do to understand the age and the condition of the equipment. And that whole process for years has been manual and has been disconnected, in the sense that you would literally go into a plant room and scrub a nameplate and get the date and say, okay, this chiller is 12 years old or 14 years old or whatever. Let's put it in for renewal, whatever the type of equipment. I'm not saying the chillers all get upgraded at that point, but there's a equipment manufacturer will say, upgrade the equipment after this length of time. The challenge with that approach is a building could have 5 chillers and one of them might run for, 1 month of the year. And when it does run, it runs pretty well. Your problem could actually be a newer piece of equipment that was installed maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but if you don't have the data from it, then you end up upgrading an older piece of equipment that's actually performing fine, when the real sinner is something that was potentially either undersized when it was specified, or installed incorrectly, or commissioned incorrectly. And the embodied energy in getting a new piece of chiller plant from overseas on a diesel ship down to Australia, you break it apart. If it's typically they're in a basement location. You have to bring the parts down in a service lift, the compressor, and bring it back up. And all of that is totally unnecessary. It'll take, dozens and dozens of years to offset the embodied energy gone into that new chiller if you could extend the life cycle of the existing one whilst still improving environmental performance. And that's their kind of requirement. And when you talk about, where sustainability and technology and market demands are going, the more sophisticated property owners are saying, let's get more out of what we already have and ensure that the maintenance cycles that are happening within it are optimized so that equipment can last for absolutely as long as possible.
I remember you telling me, Dave, some years ago about the amount of carbon that's involved in the production of concrete that's used to make buildings. And we're now, when you talk about the sustainable built environment, I think you told me like the production of concrete makes more emissions than like almost every country in the world combined. It was a massive number. So we start to talk about what Davina's talking about there around, sustainable builds and reuse of materials, and thinking about how everything goes around. Ultimately, whether we like it or not, we live in a circular world where the stuff that we dump ends up back in the world somehow. So we need to rethink the way that happens. Can you talk to me about where you're seeing some of the greatest progress towards sustainable built environments at the moment and beyond?
Was that for me, Anthony?
For you, Dave, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the built environment is like, especially in Australia, and we're talking about global trends. I always, I'm now a lot of the time in the US, and we have a team in Europe. And as I look at how far advanced the Australian property sector is compared to other markets, you have to start with those mega trends around embodied carbon, around the mandatory disclosure, which is just table stakes here in Australia. That's only coming into New York now with things like Local Law 97. Denver has an energy use intensity for buildings. California is doing its own thing, like aside from any of the federal government in the US. And, we're at the stage in Australia where we're talking about very advanced things like grid interoperability and really getting to the embodied carbon optimization. In other countries around the world, they are honestly 15 to 20 years behind. They're really just starting to get in, because Davina touched on it previously in another chat we had around that kind of Goldilocks nature of the Australian real estate investment trust market, where it's a big enough country that, you can have many real estate investment trust, but then the size of the country means you have to run those assets really well. And the competitive yet collaborative nature of the Australian owners means that people tend to want to do really well against each other in performance, but also tend to want to work really well together. And kind of that doesn't exist globally, which I don't think a lot of people know and are aware of. It is like, if you look at the disclosure and the GRESB and the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, if you look at the likes of GPT, are number one out of I think it's 842 global real estate investment trusts in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And the GRESB there's 4 Australian businesses in the top 5, and in all the US in GRESB in the top 5 there's only 2 real estate investment trusts. When you think of a country with nearly 10 times the population of Australia, so it gets recognized, but I just don't feel it gets recognized enough as to how advanced the sector really is, and the nuances and where we're taking the things that people are focused on now in relation to sustainability linked loans, interrogating alternative sources of equipment, and kind of working with government in the collaborative way that they do in Australia.
It's really interesting just hearing what Davina and David have said there, Mark, around all the different metrics that are out there. David was describing the US environment where, like, in 3 different jurisdictions, there were 3 very different ways of looking at the sustainability metrics. And Davina's talking about consolidating some metrics across different jurisdictions now and trying to come up with global indexes for global fund managers. When we see these range of different metrics and indicators around sustainability performance popping up, which ones do you think investors are going to focus their attention on the most going forward? Where will investor reporting be headed in the sustainability space?
Yeah, look, I think Davina's probably better positioned to answer that one than me in terms of the specific metric. I don't know if there is a specific metric, to be honest. I actually think what's really important is how accurately are the underlying measurements that are taken that are reflected in those metrics, and can those metrics be relied on, and how realistic are the forecasts to net zero? I mean, ultimately, that pathway to net zero, I think, is where all the focus is ultimately, and you can measure that in many different ways. Having said that, and we sort of touched on it a number of times, embodied carbon, and measuring, I guess, what that represents as it relates to structure is going to be massive in focus, because you have no choice. Interestingly, it's over 8% of global emissions, and it's actually greater than the entire global fleet of cars. So you think about all the focus on EVs and Tesla and everything else, and concrete actually contributes more. And there's a couple of products that have just come out that halve those emissions. So thinking about how to deal with embodied carbon, other than just produced carbon, which Davina mentioned, I think will be increasingly in focus. Having said that, it's going to sound like an ad for David probably, but it makes the measurement of energy and plant utilisation, combined with clearly defined operational efficiency actions, as a necessary minimum. And underline actions, there's a lot of talk quite often, but the ability to actually take action and make that result in an outcome that you can measure, and then define a different pathway, I think is going to be the new norm. It's also going to make AI, married with the sensors and the data, I think critical, because humans can't scan it properly anyway, which is why the actions historically have been, I guess, compromised. So the ability to have alerts that really pinpoint out, where the issues lie, digital twins, which we'll probably get onto later on, and documented responses and measurable outcomes. And then that comes back, obviously, to the whole concept of circular economies, and that becomes, the new age. The other thing, which I know, once again, Davina will probably have some comments on, but I think the well measures, well's had its drawbacks, but at the end of the day, looking at things, as David said, thermal heat, air quality, they all go to the experience of the customer, the end user. So a lot more focus on that. Take air quality as an example. I think you'll see oxygen levels, carbon monoxide, particulates, and pathogens increasingly measured real time. You know, HEPA filters and ultraviolet light can address that very easily, but they actually have to be operational 100% of the time, and you have to be able to demonstrate that. So, you know, they're the sorts of, I guess, metrics I think we'll see increasingly focused on.
Thanks for that, Mark. So let's move the discussion along a little bit and talk about some tenant and retailer expectations that are out there. Understanding occupier metrics is essential for driving asset performance. You know, we heard Dave talk about that earlier about, you know, lift performance and thermal comfort and things like that. It's crucial for owners and managers of commercial real estate to stay attuned to the changing needs and expectations of tenants and retailers. Now, Davina, you think about some of the senior leaders you talk to that lease large commercial spaces. What are their current expectations around the spaces that they occupy? Do you see those expectations changing?
We just partnered with Selena Short from EY and did a report on this that you'll see a great write-up in the Fin. 92% of tenants in a joint survey we did were saying that they wanted to focus more on green spaces. So this is at the right heartbeat for more than 9 out of 10, and 100% of them said they had their own targets. So, you know, I remember 15 years ago running tenant sessions and sitting by myself when no one cared. That has changed. And they are now looking at their landlords and property partners of saying, how do you make this easier for me? We're seeing policy come into this space. So you heard it here first. I'm predicting mandatory disclosure. We're going to see more of that in other asset classes. Why would you take the top global performing decarbonisation system, you know, Office Neighbours, the reductions we've had in that space are second to none globally. Why would you keep that genie in the bottle for office only? We've got massive gaps. We're not using it hard in retail. We're not going hard in hotels. We are not going hard in office tenancies. This federal government will be looking to move in this space, and I look forward to seeing announceables, but it's all going to be about know your customer, know your customer, know your customer. And for them, they're overwhelmed in this market. They want cheaper space. And the way to do that, they want you to be using less energy, and they want you to be working with them to tell their head office their sustainability story. And they want your help making sense of all this sustainability complexity. How do I do it? How do we do it together? How do we do it yesterday?
Oh, that sounded very, very forthright. So thanks for sharing that. Like, the enthusiasm that's behind this is really, really strong. And I think it's really important that we are listening to these messages. And it's great to see the government starting to get behind this. Dave, it's looking like employers are going to continue to encourage teams back into their offices, at least for part of the week, maybe 2 or 3 days at least. What are some of the new and innovative ways that owners of office spaces can do? What can they do to enhance that experience for tenants?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's the usual kind of, like, there's an awful lot of investment in end of trip facilities, and we kind of see that through increased water usage for a lot of building owners, because people are cycling to work or walking to work or jogging to work, and then they have their own kind of facilities that have kind of caught them on surprise with that usage. Then it comes back to like their focus on the comfort levels. I know we've spoken about this a couple of times already, but you know, if you're going to earn that commute, if you want to get someone back to the office, at the minimum, it needs to be comfortable all day. The other things is then back to that, the want for those tenants to know that they're occupying a high performing space. So Mark touched on the secondary stock issue and how that's either going to be left behind as a stranded asset, or it's going to need to go through refurbishment. And when that is being refurbished, it's again a focus on environmentally high performing materials, but then in operations that it's meeting all the various different sets of standards. They're the things that we see. Apart from that, there's obviously leasing things that are well outside of my domain of expertise, but the environmental stuff is here to stay. And for a lot of the owners, they can't get investment from their investors unless they're demonstrating on other assets that this money is going to be put to a high performing asset.
So, Davina, we've got a question from our audience for you. So these are the fun ones where you've got no idea what's coming next.
They're my favourite.
So what's the current rate rental premium for a more environmentally forward-thinking premises that tenants are prepared to accept? And is that gap starting to widen or close in the current market?
Yeah. Well, excitingly, we measure this gap in different ways. Green Star with the Green Building Council of Australia, we get 13% better overall returns than non-rated buildings. So what are the things that contribute to that? If you Google Green Star outperformance, you can see the excellent analysis from Anthony DiFrancesco in this space. But why do we get better performance? It's because tenants are stickier. They like them more, so they stick around longer. So over 20% better WALE because tenants want to stay. Lower vacancy, so in a market like this, it isn't always does it go for a higher rate. It's do they move in and do they stay in a tough market that we're often talking about, but we're also seeing a rental premium. I would actually say that the differential figures are so high, more than double digits. And let's face it, nobody's seeing double digit returns in this market in anything other than sustainability. We now really should be talking about the brown discounts and how bad they are. And are those the resi accommodation of the future rather than talking about green premiums? Because the green premiums are so high in the asset classes like office where we can measure them consistently. What's fascinating is we're seeing them in other asset classes. So I've certified more net zero industrial facilities than anything else. Why? Because the Nikes of the world have scope 3 requirements for their warehouses globally. And they need to move fast to the leaders' requirements, be it the global Amazon's net zero commitment. So we see it going through that value chain fast. And nothing moves faster to net zero operations than an industrial facility with some beautiful LEDs and a very big solar. So I think we're seeing quite a lot of movements in that space. I think the challenge in some areas, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, happy to take a hard question in this area, is in electrification. We're starting to have tenants go out hard and ask for it, and to have a facility fully, powered by renewables, you're going to need to electrify it. But that's one that we've got to stage over time. And you've got to do it in a long sequence, some of those capital plans that Dave was talking about. And we're actually going to have to work through partner education. If you have a building that's 10 years old, it's going to take us a while to electrify it, which is why we need more of that in the code. So it's built right up front, but it's going to be medium-term transitions while we go through tech transitions in big existing buildings.
Thanks for that, Davina. Thanks for the participant who threw that question into the mix. So, Mark, let's just bring this back to retail tenants just for a sec. During your time at Stockland, you would have seen retailer preferences shift and evolve. What do you anticipate will be the focus areas for retailers in the coming years when it comes to the spaces that they occupy?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think it's at two ends of the spectrum. One is focusing on delight and where it's differentiated and you capture the imagination of the customer. And the other end is, what I'd call extreme discount and where you're really focused on value for money with a consumer that's obviously under a fair bit of pressure. I guess a term that I've sort of focused on for a while, which I think will ultimately catch on, is what I'd call optimized phygital. And that's all about creating a symbiotic relationship between the physical space, digital marketing and supply chains that give a great customer experience. And while that sounds simple, it's actually very complicated to deliver. The key elements obviously include things like store layouts that people can relax in. And in that regard, you can see it, pretty much to some level, almost every retailer type. Fit outs, a bit like office. They're increasingly resembling high-end homes and hotels. A good example for me was when my daughter bought a prom dress recently. I mean, going into, boutique after boutique, it's just like walking into a really luxurious home, and whether it's curated music or beverage of your choice or whatever, it's a really sort of engaging environment. If you've ever seen Italy overseas, I think that's the equivalent in food, and that's you've got cooking classes and curated restaurants and traditional Tuscan setting, and something that's quite differentiated. In camping equipment, you look at something like REA in LA, Nike, or Adidas lifestyle stores. So, and then I guess from there, this is all further out, but real-time in-store customization and partial manufacturing of product, I think is certainly an area of focus, and also clearly now baseline, click and collect, click and deliver, integrated supply chain, understand where the product is, get to the customer as fast as humanly possible, and if you can't, then manage your expectations around that. And of course, all those trends will also continue to be tremendously positive for logistics and industrial.
So just as a bit of a follow-up to that, Mark, from our audience, what about retailers rather than shoppers? What are the retailer preferences when leasing spaces and weighing up landlords and what they offer?
Well, I mean, they all want to be where the highest foot traffic is, of course. That hasn't changed, and they want low rent. and of course, having said that, I'd say, and I've been obviously away from it a little bit now for a few years, but the lowly lit malls, the lack of natural light, lack of water features, lack of sculpture and art, lack of that. I think that's what you typically define as a secondary centre. In the US, there's about 600 of those that have gone out of business and are getting redeveloped. I mean, we never got the same oversupply in Australia, but you can, a bit like office, you're seeing a real focus on, if you're going for what I just described in digital, the retailers want to be in those high traffic, high engaging environments, and it's not just about, so it's an extension of what I talked about in the store, in the mall. So you got to have wide malls, you've got to have customer safety, and obviously the horrific events of whatever a week or so ago in Bondi sort of emphasise that what will be a renewed focus on that. Amenity, public amenity around things like beverage and lifestyle, as well as the retailer experience. I mean, it just keeps coming back to experience.
And I'll jump in there. I think we're seeing the retailers have a renaissance, I would say, for how they engage with their customers. Mark gave some examples like Italy that we're seeing overseas, but I'd say Country Road in Australia, so they're redesigning a lot of their fit outs to try and show their ethos in the product they bring to market. So they've got recycled clothes, but guess what? On their walls, they've got fabrics that are left over out of, their processes in their factories. They've got cool clothing hooks that are made out of recycled ocean plastics. And guess what? They then partner with the not-for-profit that pulled it out of the ocean, and they sell their jewelry in the store. So what they're doing is they're taking the message when you walk in the store, they're bringing it into their value proposition. They're talking about it differently. We're seeing that we're partnering with brands from Woolworths to like L'Occitane. Can I say, the most confronting part of this role is if you open a Country Road, they do it with a Vogue photo shoot. It's quite confronting for a boring engineer like me. But I'd have to say we're seeing retailers bring this community conversation to the heart of the consumer.
Yeah, look, that's so fascinating to me, because I kind of think about when I go and shop and what it's like, and where I choose to shop makes a big difference. And obviously the retailers have got some pretty big decisions about where they put themselves, so that I do walk through with my wallet or credit card. Let's move the discussion on to our last major topic, which is around technology and data. It's clear that technology is super important towards achieving these sustainability goals and improving these experiences for not just for customers, but also for tenants and retailers and so on. Davina, the GBCA are huge advocates for embracing data to run buildings, something that obviously Dave and his crew at CIM are really passionate about. What are some of the keys for asset managers to ensure that they're using data to its full potential?
Yeah, we've been talking for a long time about data being the new oil, but I think now that statement's often overpromised, and underimagined. We're still in the first generation where you've historically had worse tech in the office than you have at home. Let's face it, the Domino's Pizza app is actually sometimes giving you better service provision than your base building. And that's the gap we've got to close, right? That's what the opportunity here looks like. So that's for everything like the Green Building Council announced a 2020 partnership with Microsoft to digitize everything. Why? Because data is the oil. If you work with us, I want to be giving it back to you to give it to your investors rather than reprocessing the same darn thing many times. So there's that reporting side, which has been a slow grind and had far too much friction in the system. I think we're going to see that change over the next 2 years. Why? Because investors are so data hungry that we can't hire enough people to do it across the spectrum. And we actually need to streamline that so that we can actually get the right data in the right place rather than spending more time in spreadsheets with the data. So that's one big focus. I think the other thing is it's all been about efficiency in the data space. I think we're going to see right place, right time. So when you use energy matters. What does that mean? If the sun is shining and the solar energy is almost free, getting our buildings to really lean into that. And tech is going to play a different part in different sectors. So I'll give you a very tangible example of this. Since my husband got solar, an app, and an EV, he'll routinely text me that it's a great time to turn on the washing if I have the misfortune to work from home, because he's got an app that's telling him what's going on. Now, the fundamentals of that haven't changed, but he's worked out he's saving money and he's got an app that's telling him about it. So suddenly, something that was an impossible consumer education decision, if there's a Tesla battery in there somewhere in an app, there's a whole different part of the market that's engaged in that. And we can take things that were considered to be impossible and we can actually move them pretty quickly. We're seeing a lot of this overseas. California, I think, is the best grid example. They send people a text message. It's really hot. If you all keep using your aircon, we're going to lose power for 3 days. Could you turn something off so the grid doesn't fail? Text message. Very high response. So I think there's low tech, medium tech, and high tech solutions, but we're going to need buildings to work better with the grid. The way I explain this to people who are outside of buildings is my daughter learned to play the flute at junior band. Thank God she can finally play the flute, so it's less painful at home. When I go to supervise junior band, they are still learning for the whole band to play together. That's where we are with the built sector and the energy system. We've got a few buildings that can play the flute really well. We are not playing well, and we are really at a junior band standard at an energy system.
Maybe just to add to that, I think Davina had the data behind this, but the EV and electrification in the buildings, as I understand it, put something like a 9x requirement on power. There is no baseload solution for a 9x change in power requirements globally. Yes, we'll do gas peakers. Yes, we'll ultimately, I think, do nuclear, but ultimately you're just going to have to use things a lot more efficiently. And those alerts that Davina talked about, it won't just be a text. They'll actually offer you money to turn stuff off, I suspect, because it'll be that crucial to the underlying base load of the entire energy system.
Yeah, we did a report with Dr. Craig Rusak on this. If you Google GBCA, grid interruptive buildings, 1.7 trillion that you can save in this space. You can take a coal power station off the grid if you shift power demand by a few days. So big bucks in this space.
Yeah.
Let's just dive in. We've only got a couple of minutes left in our allotted time, so I just want to really make sure we round this out very quickly. Dave, we've talked about a lot of different trends here, but the thing about trends is that they start off as one thing, but sometimes they disappear, and we realise they weren't really trends; they were just sort of passing fads. Particularly when it comes to technology. what guidance can you offer property professionals when it comes to distinguishing between fleeting trends and, initiatives that are going to genuinely enhance the value of their assets?
So it's simple for me. Always work backwards from a business problem. If there's a need, like let's say corrective or preventative maintenance, if that's a line item that someone wants to get on top of and take a 25% reduction into it, then use data to get into that line item. If it's planned maintenance costs, there's also solutions for, or extending, deferring capital expenditure. Then if that's a requirement to increase profitability, then work backwards from that problem. And whatever tool you're using, Mark mentioned it in relation to action, right? We talk about climate action, but then action within any kind of software platform is just, that's where it all happens. And Davina mentioned spreadsheets. Now, spreadsheets have evolved to dashboards, but if you're tracking the usage on a dashboard and nobody's logging in, then no one's getting any benefit. Whereas when you track the usage on a platform that people use to collaborate, we track it with a thing called MAU, monthly active usage. And if the MAU on a software platform or if a provider that is working with a real estate owner can't tell the owner what their supply chain, their users, their facility managers, their maintenance technicians are doing, well, then typically there's no action. And if there's no action, you don't get any results. So my advice to any owner is any tool that you have, nobody wants another technology, they want the outcome, right? So they need to know how well it's being used, how is the data actually solving a business problem, and how are they benchmarking internally if they have, the case of one of our clients, 70 buildings on the platform, how is building number 18 performing against number 61? So that's the internal benchmarking, but then externally, how are they comparing to their to their competitors? And that all comes with good data sets and good usage.
Well, we're really close to the end of our time. I'm going to ask my panelists to give me a 1-minute answer each on the next question or so. Let's see how we go with trying to limit ourselves to a minute. Mark's going to get one without notice because we just have a very quick question that's come in from our audience. So, Mark, what developments or evolutions in commercial property have surprised you during your time as the head of research at UBS and now?
Probably the explosion in data centers. Obviously, we always could see growth in the underlying, evolution of data requirements and what that means for processing capability. But now with AI, literally exploding and seeing, I guess, massive increases in requirements. And then how, I guess, this whole idea of phygital is really starting to come to land in terms of, what I would call an integrated environment, and whether that be in an office building, in a retail asset, really looking at them helicopter view, how do they fit together and how do you create a better customer experience? We're still a long way from getting it all right, but, seeing some really fantastic advancement in that concept.
Thanks. And Davina, what are you most excited about in the dynamic world of commercial property? And if you're going to describe the state of the Australian commercial property market in one word, what would that one word be?
Goldilocks. We have the Goldilocks environment. David talked about GPT winning DJSI. DJSI for the last 15 years has been held within a 1 kilometre radius of leading Australian property groups, and long may it stay that way. Why? We've got enough big leaders in the room with enough market scale and a small enough market that they know and like each other and want to partner up. Like David said, we want to compete where we can compete, but collaborate to drive the market forward. What excites me, the scale of problems that we have to solve together is the bit that gets me out of bed every morning. What excites me is that for the first time in a decade, we've got policy at our back as we push through this. And I'm particularly excited about the mandatory disclosure space. Looking forward to seeing energy certificates at hotels near you soon.
And Dave, just to close us out, what's got you most excited in the world of commercial property, and what one word would you use to describe the state of the Australian commercial property market?
The only word I can think that comes to mind is collaboration, right? It's a very collaborative environment, and it's exciting to see that between government, the leading owners, the tenants, and the Scope 3 emissions when you look at manufacturers, and Davina touched on Nike, and then right down to the supply chain, to the maintenance contractors. So everyone is committed, everyone that's kind of values the contracts they have with different building owners or with different suppliers is really trying their best in Australia. I think it's a very collaborative environment, and it'll be great when the government takes it, pushes the bar up from underneath and brings, you know, neighbours into museums, hospitals, hotels, schools, etc., everything. Why not?
So, Mark, what about for you? What are you most excited about, and what's your one word?
There's probably two words: game changer. There's always
We can hyphenate. That's good.
The built form, is the home of the economy. So, you get your home right, you get everything right. And the economy, I always think about in terms of dollars and in terms of people's happiness. So, the things we've been talking about, a more attractive space, more comfortable space, safer space, greater walkability, greater sustainability. These things, really, I think also can go to how people feel. And it's really, you saw some recent data out by the economists, the wealthy world has had a deterioration in happiness. And to see young people being the least happy, I think is devastating, and it's something we should all be really concerned about. And, I think creating great places, as always, can be a deep contributor to improved happiness and a more sustainable environment more broadly. And of course, for that, we need to measure things and then make good decisions based upon the accuracy of those measurements.
Well, I want to thank everybody who's attended today's webinar and sent questions to our panelists. A big thank you to Davina, Mark, and Dave for sharing their insights today. For those of you that have been to a few other CIM webinars, you'll have seen all three of our panelists before. So we decided to call this the All Stars lineup. We've brought back some of our favourites for a follow-up webinar. Once this webinar completes, there will be a short survey for you to complete. Please do that. It really does help us hone what topics we do in future, and to really make sure that we deliver the best possible webinars for you as we go ahead. I want to wish you well and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar we have. Keep an eye for the next event on CIM's LinkedIn page or in your inbox. But with that, I thank everybody for their time and have a great day.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Anthony.